I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we continue dissecting the phone call between Putin and Trump and what it means for the prospect of negotiations. We discuss the latest Russian Frankenstein missile and new tactics on the ground. We also dive into a report investigating Russian strikes on hotels near the frontline in an effort to target journalists. Finally, we hear a dispatch from Sweden and a short interview with the Swedish Chief of Defence Staff on the Russian threat on the Finnish border.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 20th of May. 3 years and 86 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Associate Editor for Defence Dom Nicholls, foreign breaking news reporter Iona Cleave, dialing in from Kyiv, Kenza Rharmaoui, a senior researcher at Hounds, an organisation that investigates war crimes, and finally, my colleague Venetia Rainey, who hosts Battle Lines, reports from Sweden. Dom, what is the fallout from the phone call between Putin and Trump yesterday afternoon?
Yeah, thanks, Adélie. Hello, everybody. I suppose the fallout is the slightly disappointing news that Putin and Trump didn't fall out. I mean, there was not a lot that came out yesterday. That's the bluff, the bottom line up front, the TLDR, if you like. There was a 2-hour conversation yesterday afternoon between Putin and Trump. No meaningful outcome, was the headlines, if you were in a rush. Russian state media carried Putin's words, saying that the things are generally on the right track, saying that there's a memorandum of understanding to allow for future talks, although, what on earth is a memorandum of understanding, and how does that differ from a very large can being kicked down the road, I wonder. Anyway, Putin said that a ceasefire with Ukraine is possible upon reaching relevant agreements. There's always the qualifying clause to what he says. Ceasefire possible upon reaching relevant agreements. Russia is in favour of stopping hostilities, but it is necessary to develop the most effective path to peace. Can you hear that, Can? Russia and Ukraine must find compromises that suit both sides. Russia is ready to work on a memorandum with Ukraine, including a ceasefire. But the main thing, here we go, is to eliminate the root causes of the crisis. So no change whatsoever from Putin's position, from the long-standing Russian position. The whole framing from Russia, we're in favour of negotiations once our conditions are met. There was no display of good faith, no actual desire to stop the fighting. And that last point about the main thing is to eliminate the root causes of the crisis. That says it all. Putin has not budged an inch. He never intended to. His big concern was whether his intransigence was going to push Donald Trump to finally take action against him, which was always a long shot and doesn't seem to have happened. But that was the only thing Putin wanted to get out of it. He wanted to get through the phone call intact with no meaningful action from the US, and that seems to have been the case. Anyway, Donald Trump posted a little while later, so this is still yesterday evening, on social media in order to put the best possible light on the phone call. He said, "The tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent." He then said, rather tellingly, Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. Now, that phrase, as it can only be between Ukraine and Russia. And yet all the framing up to this point, including just a few days ago, was that it was a face-to-face meeting between Trump and Putin that was going to unlock everything. Trump said it informed, interesting use of word, informed President Zelensky after the phone call, as well as a list of European leaders. Now, these are the same European leaders that he completely ignored when they had proposed sanctions unless Putin agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. You'll remember that after the Istanbul talks, so-called talks last week. Now, European leaders, you're not off the hook yet for that tub-thumping sanctions chat, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But anyway, a week ago, you'll remember, Europe had no part to play. They had the rug pulled from under their feet. They were undermined by Trump when they proposed this 30-day ceasefire on the back of nothing coming out of Istanbul. Trump then kind of ignored them and said, no, look, I'll meet Putin, whatever phone call. Completely undermined the European leaders. Anyway, apparently, now they're back in vogue because Trump spoke to Ursula von der Leyen, Emmanuel Macron, Giorgia Meloni from Italy, Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, and Chancellor Friedrich Merz. He also said the Vatican, quote, has stated that it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. Let the process begin. That was the end of his the end of his message on social media. It only had one exclamation mark at the end of that, so you know that not even his heart was really in it. Later on last night, speaking at an event outside the White House, he said, we just spent 2.5 hours talking to Vladimir Putin, and I think some progress has been made. It's a terrible situation going on over there, so hopefully we'll do something. We also spoke to the heads of most other European nations, and we're trying to get that whole thing wrapped up. What a shame that it ever happened in the first place. So there you go. That really sums it up. These phrases, some progress, and hopefully we'll do something. I mean, it really speaks of action, resolve, determination, pushing the ceasefire. That sums up the whole afternoon from both Trump and Putin. All their statements, they were very wishy-washy, empty sentences, a very bland word salad where the only roots were causes and the only takeaways were nothing that we haven't all had before. I mean, yes, it's good to talk. It's good that leaders talk, but we can't allow ourselves to mistake activity for action, let alone progress. The question is, I think, what next? Has Trump just thrown this whole issue over the fence to Europe? Is he going to walk away? That might be a good thing because Europe and European leaders are much more clear-eyed about the threat from Russia, and Europe has the means to do something about it, as long as they get their act together and as long as the US market remains open, i.e. being able to buy weapons from the US. But it would be bad if Trump walking away means cutting off all US support, materiel, as in with an E on the end, equipment. We've had a few questions about why Francis and I keep talking about materiel. I mean as in military equipment, but also money and intelligence support as well. So the headline from yesterday was nothing really happened, but I think that is quite telling in and of itself, Adélie.
Thank you. And so what's the latest from the front then? What's going on the battlefield?
I mean, not a huge amount on the front lines. I mean, I'm not saying there's no movement at all. There is continued pressure, pressed for the last couple of weeks, really, just to the southwest of Konstantinivka in the Donbass. We reported last week that Russia had got across that road, the road that links Konstantinivka with Pokrovsk. They've crossed the road about halfway along around the in the vicinity of Makhinivka, a village there. Now, Russia's working to expand that bulge and is seeking to push sort of northeast towards Konstantinivka. If you take that town, Konstantinivka, Russian forces are now about 8 kilometres away from the northeast, about 15 k's southeast, and 10 kilometres to the southwest. So there's not an encirclement at all. It doesn't go all the way around, and B, it's not uniformly close, but there's increased pressure. That seems to be where Russia is really, really pushing hard at the moment. There is pressure elsewhere, of course, even if not a lot of movement on the front line. In Sumy Oblast, nearly 56,000 residents had to be evacuated as efforts continue to relocate residents under mandatory evacuation orders. That comes from Ole Hirov, governor of Sumy Oblast. He was speaking yesterday. That area has been subjected in the past few months to near daily glide bomb attacks and a number of small unit assaults by Russia across the border, probing the lines, looking for gaps, but also seeking to keep Ukrainian forces fixed there, defending, so not able to be freed up to assault elsewhere or even try to expand the tiny amount of land that Ukraine still holds inside Russia. It was still very active yesterday, despite the lack of movement. 1,030 casualties, Russian casualties, reported by Ukraine's general staff, continuing the pattern of recent months. Russian attacks across Ukraine yesterday killed at least one civilian, injured over a dozen, mostly in the Donbass. 108 drones fired at the country. Just a couple more military updates, Adélie. Defence support for Ukraine was back in vogue over the weekend. First, on Saturday, Denmark announced a military aid package worth 4.2 billion Danish kroner. That's about $630 million. That's to cover the next 3 years and includes artillery systems and ammunition, plus equipment for fighter jets and funding for Ukraine's Air Force training facilities. Then, do you remember that kerfuffle a few weeks ago about the Australian M1 Abrams tanks that Australia was getting rid of and weren't going to send to Ukraine? Well, turns out Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met President Zelensky on Sunday and confirmed that the tanks would be going to Ukraine. So ABC reported yesterday that the first of 49 Abrams tanks are already en route. Then to finish the weekend, Monday, not quite the weekend, the Finnish Ministry of Defence said yesterday it had signed an agreement with the European Commission to supply Ukraine with materiel and heavy ammunition worth 90 million euros, about $100 million, or using the profits from frozen Russian assets. Now, connected to kind of military support, but on the sanctions side of life, EU's top diplomat and Francis Derny pin-up Kaja Kallas said this morning that the EU has formally approved its 17th package of sanctions on Russia. She said in a tweet this morning, targeting nearly 200 Shadow Fleet ships. New measures also address hybrid threats and human rights. She didn't go into any more detail. She said more sanctions on Russia are in the works. The longer Russia wages war, the tougher our response. It comes, you may remember, about Shadow Fleet. It comes after that incident last Thursday when the Jaguar, this unflagged Shadow Fleet vessel routing through the Baltic Sea, went to be inspected by the Estonian Coast Guard and then unflagged. So, it doesn't belong to any country. But suddenly a Russian fighter flew over it as a show of strength, and that fighter flew through Estonian airspace for about a minute. Now, I asked Estonia's Defence Minister Hanno Pevkur about that incident at the that conference I was at, the Lennart Meri conference last weekend. We're going to run that interview a little bit later this week. The point is that the Jaguar did continue unhindered by the Coast Guard and got into Primorsk, the port in Russia. It's due to sail back, it's going to fill up with oil there and sail back in the next few days. So there was a lot of chat over this, over the defence conference as to whether or not Estonia will call NATO Article 4. Now, Article 5 we all know about, the collective, the Mutual Defence Pact. Article 4 convenes the North Atlantic Council in the event of a security threat. So the big decision now for Estonia is whether or not they formally go to NATO and request under Article 4 a meeting of the Council. As I say, during the conversation over the weekend, Lithuania's Foreign Minister Kęstutis Budrys, he said that this is a test. This is a test for us. We have to go for it, i.e., do you let the Jaguar just sail back out of Primorsk and head off to wherever it's going to sell the oil to? Asked why it's so difficult to sanction these vessels, he said we have to reduce the level of proof in order to sanction vessels, and that last Thursday's incident had changed the picture. I'm not so sure myself. I think it would be quite a bold step, actually, to enact Article 4 and see what happens. But we'll see how Estonia chooses to act. It does throw it into sharp focus, though. The Baltic Sea Shadow Fleet, should Estonia, should NATO, but Estonia's sort of the closest there to Russia, should Estonia close the Black Sea for sanctioned vessels? If so, how do they do it? What are the risks? And just so we know what we're talking about, the Shadow Fleet, we talk about, consists of about 500 vessels. It's about 17% of the global oil tanker fleet, and 60 to 80% of Russian oil exports go through the Baltic Sea. There are thought to be at the moment about 350 vessels sanctioned by the EU, slightly fewer by the UK and US. And just one final one from me, Adélie, just to bring you up to date. So I gave most of this back brief from the conference yesterday. So if you missed that, just the first 10 minutes or so, get you up to speed on the current thinking of European political and military community. One other one that I didn't have time for yesterday, there was quite a bit of discussion about reform of the UN. Now, regular listeners will know my view on the UN, but the president of Slovenia, Nataša Pirc-Musar, she said the UN is non-operative. It is paralysed. So a lot of talk about, how do you restructure the UN? As a heads up, my view, for what it's worth, is that the UN was set up after the Second World War for one job and one job only, and that was to prevent World War III. It did that brilliantly. The trouble is, it is not fit for today's world, in my view. The way it's structured, the relationship between the Security Council and the General Assembly, the relationship between having permanent members and the veto power, most importantly. Anyway, Alexander Stubbs, as I said, the president of Finland, he's the guy you'll remember played golf with Trump, managed to get that deal, sold him a load of ice-breaking ships. He said the UN needs to reform and said the West is losing the global diplomatic battle. He suggested, this is a NATO member, very, very large nation, Finland. The president says we should double the number of seats on the Security Council. We should remove veto powers from the P5, and we should suspend voting rights of countries who act against the UN Charter, i.e. by invading their neighbours. He incidentally called Robert Fico, the president of Slovakia, his attendance at Russia's Victory Day parade vulgar. Keep your eye on Alexander Stubbs. I think he's one to watch. Anyway, Estonia's president, Ala Karis, said he had spoken to the UN Secretary-General about reform, and he said that Mr Guterres, the Sec-Gen, was open to ideas about how to empower the UN General Assembly, but was a total non-starter. Wasn't interested in this idea of removing veto power. And of course, you've then got, well, how the hell does that work anyway? Even if that was an idea, how do you get it through? Because that idea would be vetoed. How do you reform the UN if there is this veto power? But as long as there is the veto power and one of the UN permanent members like Russia wants to invade a neighbour, what can the world do about it? So a real bind for the world, I think, about the UN. It did come up at the weekend. Interesting ideas put out there. No real progress, but the fact that they are talking openly, presidents are calling for such reform of the UN, I thought was very interesting. I better take a pause there, Adélie, because we've got a lot to get through.
Thank you, Dom. And yes, you've got a heavy schedule ahead of us, but that's some really interesting food for thought here that you just left us with. I want to turn to Iona Cleave, who's a foreign breaking news reporter now. Iona, thank you for joining us again on the podcast. You've just released an article about a new type of weapon that's being used by Russia. I think it's called banderol, and it's been nicknamed the Frankenstein weapon. Can you tell us what it is and what's so different about it and what's at stake with this new weapon? Why this name?
Hi, so the S8000 banderol, which sort of translates in English to small parcel, was this unidentified new Russian missile that was being fired at targets in southern Ukraine. And I mean, unofficial reports have said it's been fired since February. It's very much been kept under wraps by Russia. We didn't know about its development until last week when Ukraine's military intelligence sort of unmasked it as the banderol. It's this lightweight, low-cost weapon with a large 115-kilogram warhead. But the important parts of it is that it's made basically of this like Frankenstein-like mash of foreign source components that sort of fly in the face of international sanctions. And I think the importance about this missile is not necessarily in its lethality, but the fact that Russia's worked out a way to produce a cheap weapon that consists of lots of off-the-shelf parts, and it can do that for mass production. Its Chinese-built jet engine, for example, is sold through online marketplaces like China's AliExpress and Alibaba for as little as £12,000. It's also drone launched, which is quite interesting. So it's fired by Russia's Orion drones, which means that they're long-range drones, and also Russia doesn't have to risk tactical aircraft to fire it. And another key thing about this weapon is when Ukraine's military intelligence sort of pulled apart these downed versions of the banderol, they found 20 critical components from at least 30 countries, including Kyiv's backers and allies. There were parts from the US, Australia, Japan, South Korea. So I think it exposes sort of the depths of the sanctions hole and how Western technologies are slipping through the cracks and then actually being fired back at Ukraine. And when I spoke to analysts about this weapon, in 2022, RUSI did a report, that's a London think tank, that found 450 foreign-made components discovered in weapons being used in Ukraine. 318 of these are in the US. And when I spoke to the analysts about what was going on and why it hasn't changed, they sort of said that the same culprits are involved, the same Russian sanctioned companies, the same third countries being used to transport these technologies through them, which includes like Turkey, the UAE, and then Eastern former Soviet countries. The wider issue here is that a lot of sanctions aren't working, and it's really hard for anyone to prevent Russia from procuring them, particularly off-the-shelf parts. Like, you can't stop someone buying a commercially available piece of technology, like its engine that's being bought on China's marketplaces. And also the better due diligence by Western companies who are not asking the questions they should ask and where their technologies are ending up. An interesting example is Ukraine's military intelligence identified this chip and dip network, which is one of Russia's largest electronics distributors. It is sanctioned by the US and Ukraine, but it's not actually sanctioned by the EU or the UK or Japan or Australia. And lots of the components that were found in the banderol missile were coming through this network and getting into Russia's sort of war machine.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And we've talked a lot on this podcast about sanctions, how they work, but also the loopholes and trying to close the loopholes. I think you've also got another piece that you've published recently, Iona, about Russians on motorbikes zooming through mined areas towards enemy trenches. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, I'd love to. So these motorbike assaults have actually been going on for over a year now. I mean, they first started being spotted on front lines in April 2024. But what I was really looking at is why they're sort of being rolled out across the front sort of en masse now. I mean, analysts were reporting last week that Russia intended to integrate motorbikes into all of their new offensives in the summer and autumn, which is very interesting because if you look at them, they produce sort of staggering mass casualties. A lot of the time they're just wiped out by Ukrainian drones, the sort of suicide sort of squads. But what's interesting is the fact that Russia's continuing to use them. And when I spoke to soldiers at the front and analysts and sort of looked at battlefield reports, what's starting to happen is that they're probing Ukrainian defensives. They keep on, they're sort of relentless. They're happening across, particularly in Kharkiv and Donetsk. And what's happening is that it's sort of exhausting Ukrainian defences and they're having to use drones to wipe them out when they could be using drones for other things rather than destroying bikes, take them out with artillery. One of the people at the front that I spoke to called it the run, stab and then escape tactic. So they're not necessarily useful on their own, but they're useful in terms of sort of this broader tactical mission to sort of just keep probing relentlessly and stop Ukraine resupplying and sort of get in the way and disturb its logistics. A key thing is that they solve this greater tactical challenge of how to cross a heavily mined battlefield that's under constant surveillance from drones above and do it fast, which I think also makes sense to why Russia's using a lot of unconventional sort of vehicles. Unarmoured vehicles are turning up at the front, like bikes, even e-scooters, quad bikes, buggies, which is, I mean, fascinating when you see these sort of like videos of this all taking place. And it's also because Russia doesn't want to waste any more heavy equipment on the front. I mean, that's slow-moving tanks that have been wiped out, we've seen by FPV drones. After sort of substantial losses of tanks in 2023 and the start of 2024, Russia sort of abandoned armoured vehicle usage in the Donetsk. So, I mean, these bikes solve that sort of challenge. But I guess they're not really working on their own. It's just sort of a broader plan of wasting Ukrainian resources.
And also sending people into the meat grinder, isn't it? Because these tactics are also at a very high cost for the Russian army.
Exactly. It's sort of like the infantry meat wave assaults, because these losses that Russia's sustaining in these motorbike assaults are sort of unimaginable for Ukraine to be suffering themselves. One of the analysts I spoke to said that 25% of all new Russian assaults happening on the front are involving bikes now, which is quite substantial when people are estimating 80 to 90% of them, they take on 80, 90% casualties in these assaults. So the fact that Russia is thinking about making bikes standard equipment for some troops and some units, and then integrating specific motorbike units at the front is very, very interesting and shows how much they're willing to lose men rather than heavy equipment.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't read too much into it, except that why are they doing it? They're doing it because they have to. They've got no armoured vehicles left, so they're now using motorbikes. If you think about what they're trying to do, they're trying to close the ground from the safe location, relatively safe location, to Ukrainian trenches as quickly as possible, so they can get there before the Ukrainians can shoot all of them or bring artillery or mortars or anything else down onto them. So in that way, they're acting as in a shock action way, like shock troops, almost like paratroopers that would arrive on your position, cause havoc, and win the day. Now, the problem with these shock troops, picture on a motorbike. Well, first, you're extremely vulnerable while you're moving. Unless you're Clint Eastwood, you're not able to shoot accurately whilst you're driving a motorbike. But also, how much kit can you take with you? The whole way that paratroop forces are set up is that they are designed to be very light forces. So they haven't got a lot of heavy weaponry. They haven't got a lot of kit in their belt gear, so they've got enough to look after themselves, water, ammunition, bit of food maybe, some med kit. They've got enough to look after themselves for 24 hours, 48 hours at a push. The idea is that you launch these shock troops into a position and they are linked up with very, very quickly. You're not actually able to do an awful lot beyond taking a position, and that's going some. If you've made your way through the minefield, you've dodged the FPV drones, the artillery's not hit you, the mortar's missed, and the bloke shooting at you isn't very good. I mean, so then you get to the position, you take the position, fantastic, tier medals, and then what? You've got nothing left for 48 hours. So you're extremely vulnerable. So Russia's doing this because they haven't got any other option, really. I mean, they are, as Iona said, they're largely kind of suicide squads, former orderly Q volunteers. I mean, wow, who wants to join the motorcycle squad? It's interesting to see tactically. It's interesting to see how Ukraine counter it. But I think that what it shows more broadly is just the dire state of Russia's equipment fleet. So I don't think we should read too much into it.
Thank you, Dom. We are going to welcome on the podcast Kenza Rharmaoui. She is a senior researcher at Hounds. Good to have you on. Hounds, which is a Ukrainian organization that investigates war crimes, and you specialize in international law and international relations. And you're one of the lead researchers on a new report that Hounds has just published at the end of last week on Russia's attacks on hotels near the frontline. I think you've spent several months working on this. Tell us about the report. What have you been investigating and what's the scale? What are you covering?
Yes, sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Adélie, and thanks to everyone listening today. A joint report which was conducted with Reporters Without Borders as well. And the focus is the repeated attacks on hotels in Ukraine, many of which have been used as accommodation for journalists. So at first, we wanted to understand whether these attacks on hotels, which were increasing and that we could not ignore, were indiscriminate strikes against civilian infrastructure, or if there was something particular about these sites, about hotels that made them targets. So we based our findings on testimonies from survivors, on ground reported, everything documented by our field researchers, on open source intelligence, legal analysis, and other tools of research. Our study looked into 31 attacks on 25 hotels across the country. 8 of these attacks happened in 2022, 5 in 2023, with a sharp increase in 2024 with 14 attacks and 4 at the beginning of this year. So we can see a clear peak last year. And what we found was a range of targeting strategies. So among these attacks, one case to indeed the hotel was turned into a military object because it was following a military use. But otherwise, a clear pattern emerged, and many of the attacks against hotels were not justified under international humanitarian law because hotels remained civilian infrastructures, obviously forbidden to target. And so our studies, our key findings were that it seems to be a pattern in those attacks. They are not randomly happening. So many of them took place at night, for example, when one knows that hotels are at the fullest, right, at night. They were usually using Iskander missiles, which are precision weapons, concentrated in frontline cities. So cities that are hosting, for example, journalists, but also what we can consider special guests, or journalists, but also representatives of international organizations, or humanitarian workers. So people who come here to report and cover and help the civilians during the war, right? The intention is really strong and really clear, because if you take the city of Cleave, for instance, it was alone hit 8 times. So these attacks are not just numbers or statistics. They have a really human cost. They've caused civilian casualties, and including media professionals. And one tragic example, which we highlight in our study, is the death of Reuters security advisor, British citizen Ryan Evans, in the strike on the Sapphire Hotel in Kramatorsk on the night of the 25th of August 2024. What's really relevant in this particular case that the Sapphire Hotel in Kramatorsk is known to host only journalists. They were only hosting journalists to be able to come near the front line and cover the war recreation of Russia, right? Our findings also show that Russia was actually aware that this hotel was known to host journalists, because in 2023 there were already messages on social media from the Russian authorities saying that Western journalists were here to help covering state incidents, made by the Ukraine Security Service. This indicates that Russia was actually aware of the presence of journalists in this hotel. Nevertheless, the hotel was still struck last year, right? And what we could see when we analyzed case by case each attack and each hotel, hotels where some of them decided to actually close because of the war and not to put risk their staff, but also the guests of the hotel. Some hotels were still remaining functional as usual as before, so hosting different kind of guests, and some hostels were, for example, only hosting journalists, as I said with the Sapphire Hotel, But regardless of the strategy chosen by the hotel, they were still struck. So hotels which were closed were struck. Hotels which were hosting only journalists and who were explicitly refusing to host military servicemen were also struck. So there was really no option left to hotels to remain a safe zone, actually. And this is even more important for journalists because when you go to report near the front line, the hotel is safe zone, right, where you can go to rest. Journalists are facing much trouble going now near the front lines because there is no place left for them to stay, at least in safety. We used a survey to confirm our findings, and many journalists cited as main challenges the lack of access to safe housing, 64%. So when you know that you're going to report near the front line and you're not even sure that you can secure a safe housing, it makes everything more complicated. These journalists are also suffering from emotional trauma, with 44% of our respondents said was a direct consequence of the attacks.
So, what's the rationale for targeting hotels, and what's Russia's narrative? How do you make sense of that?
One could expect that the authorities of a country which is committing a war of aggression against another country could just deny the attacks or the allegations of war crimes, for example. But what we found here was actually a several range of justifications right after the attacks, which actually seem to be coordinated because we found really few variations among the justifications. We analyzed several Telegram channels, including those of Russian state media, military bloggers, pro-Kremlin influencers, as well as anonymous channels. And we could identify two main narratives which emerged, both of them framing the attacks as legitimate under international humanitarian law. The first narrative was to say that this hotel were actually hosting members of the Ukrainian army. And the other justifications was that the hotels were hosting foreign militaries, or representatives of foreign instructors, for instance. And the main justification that we saw many, many times is that the hotel was hosting foreign mercenaries. So the idea of foreign mercenaries became almost as a myth because it was really recurrent during our findings. What's really interesting that the notion of journalists here is either blurred with the notion of combatants in order to make the attack legitimate under international humanitarian law, or sometimes in some justifications, the distinction between both categories is here. But when journalists are seen as a distinct group of people, as civilians, for example, the narratives by Russian channel on Telegram, for example, the example that I mentioned about the Sapphire Hotel in 2023, that foreign journalists came on purpose in Kramatorsk in Sapphire Hotel to report on staged incidents in order to later on accuse Russia of committing war crimes, So whenever that there's a distinction with journalists as a separate group of people, as civilians, it is as if journalists were serving a military purpose and helping the Ukrainian army, All of the attacks and all of the justifications, Russian channels and Russian authorities never provided any evidence, and everything was denied by the work of our field researchers or other tools to deny their claims, right? And this pattern of attacks on hotels across Ukraine therefore failed to meet the legal criteria and the international humanitarian law for the targeting of military objectives. So these strikes appear, according to our findings, to qualify as war crimes, crime of intentionally attacking civilians and civilian objects, which is defined by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So we also provided clear recommendations to journalists who aim to go to Ukraine to report on the hostilities. The main recommendation here, in order to guarantee the safety of journalists, is obviously to stay away from hotels, which unfortunately now cannot be considered as safe accommodations, and to seek for a different kind of accommodations. But it's also to strengthen any safety protocols for journalists. And then finally, a report contains a call for concrete legal actions. So whether through Ukrainian courts or the International Criminal Court or under passive nationality criteria, which could be used in the UK because of the nationality of the victim rare events, for instance. And of course, I'd like to end here saying that such attacks cannot become normalized, and it's really important for organizations like Truth Hounds to keep doing a work of documenting war crimes and providing evidence and debunking also the disinformation campaigns by Russia on social media and on internet in general, to show that these attacks are not singular, they are not legitimate, but they follow a strict pattern of committing war crimes against civilians.
Thank you, Kenza. There was a fascinating deep dive into your report. Do you want to give us a bit of background on Truth Hounds? You're an organisation that investigates war crimes. So can you just kind of describe what that work is?
Truth Hounds has been investigating war crimes since 2014. We base our work on, at least our findings and our reports on the work of field researchers who go on the field after each attack, who collect testimonies from survivors. For the report on attacks on hotels, for example, we collected testimonies from the hotel staff or anyone who could provide any relevant information, which after that is analyzed, and we collect all of this information and throughout a joint effort reproduce this kind of reports with also legal analysis. So it's really a process with the effort of several teams, several departments to produce such joint efforts, and hopefully collecting war crimes is not just a report on paper, right, but the point of this is to actually lead to concrete legal action, as I've said, and to also, so hopefully one day justice can also be served for the victims.
And last question from me before we move on to final thoughts. You said the goal is to have legal action. So once the report is published, what's the next step? Does it go to a prosecutor's office or to an international court?
Yes, so the report is published and it's shared with the prosecutor office in Ukraine. We aim also to share this with the International Criminal Court. And this report and our work in general aims to be served as collecting evidence for any other legal actions, both in Ukraine, but also we aim at international level with the International Criminal Court, also national courts abroad through the principle of universal jurisdiction.
And now, my colleague Venetia Rainey, planning editor on the podcast desk and host of Battle Lines, reports from Sweden. We hear from Lieutenant General Carl-Johan Edström, Swedish Chief of Defence Staff. He spoke to us about the importance of the Gotland Regiment and the threat of Russia.
Hello from the sunny Swedish island of Gotland. I've come here to watch American, British and Swedish troops take part in the US Army's Swift Response exercises, part of their annual Defender series of drills across Europe. Now, later today, more than 100 British paras from the 16th Air Assault Brigade are going to jump out of an A400 plane, march to a nearby road, and then convert it into a runway that can receive planes with weapons. That's all going to happen overnight, and I'll be there watching as much of it as possible before I pass out. And then, first thing in the morning, we're talking 5 a.m., the US Marines are going to fire up the HIMARS that they will have taken delivery of, and the Brits are going to use their MLRS, and they're going to shoot a few rounds into the sea. I'll report back on how all of that goes for tomorrow's show, and I'm going to be doing a full dispatch on our Battle Lines podcast in the coming weeks. The message behind these drills, according to the US, is to demonstrate multinational power projection and the expansion of critical capabilities on the battlefield in the High North and the Baltics. In other words, Russia, don't think about trying anything because we're ready for you. Now, Gotland is a super interesting island for these drills to be carried out on. It's known as the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Baltics because of its hugely strategic location. Right now, I'm about 190 miles from Kaliningrad. That's the Russian enclave that's home to the Baltic Navy base. It's often said that whoever controls Gotland controls the Baltic. And that's because this island is slap bang in the middle of a number of vitally important sea and air routes in this region. Most notably, the main resupply routes to the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania in the case of war run right through here. Now, Gotland was completely demilitarised in 2005, the end of history and all of that, but following the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, Sweden decided to remilitarise it. So in 2018, the Gotland Regiment was re-established, and yesterday I went to visit their shiny new barracks. Again, you can hear more details about all of that in the coming weeks on Battle Lines, but for now I wanted to share with you guys an interview with the Lieutenant General Carl-Johan Edström. He's the Swedish Chief of Defence Staff, and he was at the Gotland Regiment barracks yesterday to meet troops alongside Britain's Vice Chief of Defence Staff, General Dame Sharon Nesmith. Edström spoke to a small group of journalists about the threat posed by Russia and why the Gotland Regiment was so important for defending Europe. Here's what he had to say.
I'm here not only for the exercise, I'm here for the key leader engagement with a high leader. She's from UK, and that I would say is also significant for the island of Gotland. It's such an important island and territory for the defense and the whole area of responsibility for NATO also. We will see the exercise swift response continuing this week, which is also one adding on the capabilities that we need to be able to deter and defend from a collective perspective this NATO area of response. From a Swedish perspective, it's really important. We are 1 year in as a NATO member. So for us, it always has been important to be a net contributor for defense and security. And I think we have shown the last year that we are saying the same thing as we are doing. We have a battalion in Latvia where on the four land forces concept, and we will rotate that together with Denmark every 6 months for the upcoming years. We have been a part of the standing naval forces concept in the Baltic Sea with several ships during the last year. And at the moment, we have also one squadron of fighters in Poland doing air policing, and soon they will transfer into protecting the support of Ukraine from the Polish side also. So we are really doing as much as we can. Parallel to this, of course, we still continue with the growth of the Swedish armed forces. We are now aiming for 2.6% of GDP, and I would say that we are probably, after the summits this summer, aiming for even higher. So the growth of the Swedish armed forces are on a very heavy projection at the moment. That would be the main statement from my side.
It seems like there's a sort of growing cooperation, deepening cooperation between the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, now with the US here, the UK as well. With this exercise and with the sort of mobilization in the area in general, what kind of signal are you aiming to send to Russia?
I would say a strong signal that we are, as you said, collectively showing that we can actually not only exercise, we can do operations jointly and doing not only basic training, but also a little bit more of high quality exercises. So I would say all the exercises that we're doing, one goal is train their plans and exercise the plans. And one other goal is actually to be a part of the deterrence.
Do you think the civil society and the military society are walking on the same pace, or does the civil society need more investment than we see currently?
I think from a willingness, we are walking in the same pace. Maybe the military, we have been working with this a little bit longer than the civilian side, but here on Gotland, I would say that they are working together parallel since 5 years back. Yeah. But it's always about how to invest and how to grow resilience in the society, because that is not a military task, it's a national task to build that resilience.
It must be from pre-2018 not having a permanent battalion here or a permanent regiment on Gotland to now being expected to work so closely with all of the NATO countries and ramp up that interoperability. Could you talk to me about some of the challenges that the regiment on Gotland specifically has faced working with NATO and being expected to host so many international partners?
They're doing really great, I would say. I mean, some of as you said, ramping up means that it takes time, especially to the personnel when it comes to permit. It started with 40 conscripts each year, building up to 100, and now they're up to this year it will be 300 coming here during next year. So having the personnel is one thing. What you see here is also infrastructure. I really love this regiment because the infrastructure is bright new, but it takes time. It takes time to build a new infrastructure.
Obviously, you've talked about the infrastructure build-up, how quickly that's going, and it takes some time. There are some challenges, but given Gotland's strategic location and being, as everyone refers it to, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, in a few years' time, once this infrastructure has been ramped up, what role do you see Gotland playing in terms of hosting permanent NATO?
One big role is to be the hub for logistical flows from west to east. It's one thing. The other one is to be a very compact power to actually control the sea line communications and also the area inside of the Baltic Sea, our own A2AV. And the third one would be also, this would be a perfect place also to build up offensive capabilities needed for deep strike, for example, in the plan, defending the NATO allied through offensive capabilities.
What do you make of the reports in Swedish broadcaster SVT of the satellite photos of Russian troop build-up on the Finnish border?
We are following this very closely. I would say to follow Russians' build-ups and what they're doing. It's our profession has been so since we never took the eyes off Russia. So we are following that closely. For us, we are knowing all the time what's happening there. What I would say is that it's very important also to understand that Russia, at the moment, they are in special operations or war against Ukraine, but they see themselves as in a long-time conflict with the West. And that means that even if the war in Ukraine, which I hope really soon will be have a ceasefire or even a peace agreement, that doesn't mean that Russia will change their mind. They will stay in conflict with the West, and that means that we can't take the eyes off Russia for the foreseeing 10 or 15 years to come.
If Russia did invade, is Sweden's army ready?
We have always been ready to fight with what we have. I would say like this, and I really mean it. Becoming allied to NATO made us much more safer. But I also hope that we made NATO a little bit stronger also doing so.
Okay, this consolidation of the Baltics, the Nordics, the US, UK, at a time when the future of NATO has been thrown into doubt by President Trump. How do you see the sort of Northern Baltic bloc's significance for NATO for the future?
From our side, it's all about the collective defense in NATO. 32 allies, we are one of the allied countries. So that is baseline on what we're working at. But there's also parallel to that, you can do some bilateral or multilateral cooperations and operations. That is all only strengthening the collective defense, but it's all about the collective defense within NATO. So it's not about creating a club inside of the club. It's about making NATO stronger.
Let's move on to final thoughts then. Dom, do you want to start? What do you want to leave us with?
Thanks, Adélie. Okay, folks, bear with me on this one. Get your pens out and a bit of paper. I said yesterday that I would talk you through the negotiation landscape as explained to me by Bob Dean, the Dutch journalist who is central, very much involved with this, whatever this negotiation process is going to be. So he outlined it very clearly for me, and I'm going to attempt to do the same for you, but I do need your assistance. So if you've got a pen and paper, that's great. If not, then just try and picture the following. So draw a line, a horizontal line on your bit of paper, and put on that line 7 points, with number 1 on the far left and number 7 on the far right. Okay, so this is the negotiation landscape. So number 1 is Ukraine's maximalist position. So a complete Russian collapse, total regime change in Moscow, complete victory for Ukraine. Okay. Number 7 on the far right-hand side is Russia's maximalist position. Again, complete victory over Ukraine, what they thought they'd achieve in 2022, total outright military conquest. Now, number 2 is Ukraine's currently accepted negotiating position. It's based on that 10-point peace formula that President Zelensky came out with a couple of years ago. They've slightly shifted since then. They're willing to accept a temporary freeze in the lines. But number 2, so just a little bit away from their maximalist position, that's kind of where they are now. Likewise, over the other side of the page, number 6 is Russia's current negotiating position, i.e. saying they want to take the 5 oblasts, the 4 in the east and Crimea, no NATO membership for Ukraine, no Western support of military kit. They want to limit the size of Ukraine's armed forces, that kind of thing, all the denazification, demilitarization rubbish. Okay. Number 4, bang in the middle, is China. Now, China doesn't really care for either side here. They don't want a Russian collapse leading to chaos on the Chinese border, but it is very much a marriage of convenience and cheap oil right now. China just wants the war to end. China doesn't like global instability. Okay. Number 3 is the position that was held by President Biden and Olaf Scholz when they were supplying kit, not enough for Ukraine to win, because they were terrified of number 1 and a total Russian collapse, but not enough for Ukraine to lose. So the fudges of all fudgy things while they try to work out what to do. So that's the sort of landscape. The problem is, number 5 there, that is Trump's current position, seemingly much closer to Russia's position than Ukraine's. I keep talking about trade. We know he likes the sort of big man politics of the world. He detests Zelensky after all that Hunter Biden stuff. The problem is that the more that Trump is over on the right-hand side, at position 5, and maybe going further right, the more that Russia and Putin is emboldened and therefore keen to shift from 6, where they're sort of happy at the moment, even though it's completely unreasonable what they're asking for at 6, but they're keen to move from 6 to 7 if they think they've got Trump on their side. They see potential of an outright victory. Now that, in turn, is pushing Ukraine from 2 to 1. And they realise if Trump is emboldening the Russian position, Ukraine realises that their reluctantly accepted negotiating position of number 2 is probably outdated and they need to harden themselves up. So they're shifting to number 1. So what we're left with after Trump's intervention and this process, which is being generous to what's happening diplomatically over this war, we're left with Ukraine and Russia further apart now than pretty much any time since February the 24th, 2022. There's no sign of a meaningful negotiation, no sign really of a ceasefire. So that's kind of where we are, and the problem that can come about if there's absent or weak or unclear, opaque leadership and direction from the US. Now, you will note that I haven't got a marker there for Europe or a name to attach to any possible European position. And that in itself is very telling and very problematic. That's an imperfect science, but that, I thought, from Bob, was a very, very intellectually sound way of just thinking about the landscape. You can disagree with where the positions are and the relative positions and who's shifting where and all the rest of it, but I thought that was a fairly easy to grasp for a former cavalry officer. That worked for me. I hope it does for you too, but let me know your thoughts. Thanks, Adélie.
Well, it worked for me. You had me doodling in my notebook, and I think maybe you should get into data visualization, Dom. Kenza, do you want to leave us with your final thoughts?
So for me, what really stood out, at the end of our study is that at the end of the day, how journalists are perceived by Russia, in Russia's view, independent journalism does not exist. Journalists are not independent, are not impartial, but they are treated as hostile actors, not as civilians. And I think that's why it's so important for us to carry their voices and to help protect them and to keep documenting war crimes in Ukraine. And why is Russia trying to silence the press? It's because the truth is not on their side. So I think it's now on our side to double our efforts to ensure that the truth and independent journalism and documentation and hopefully justice continue to prevail. Thank you, everyone.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.